This is an experience I had when I stayed with my family in a guest house way out in the mountains. My daughter was quite young when this happened. I think she was about 4. My husband and I had thought that we had put her down for the night and she was sleeping soundly. But we were wrong. We were in the living room area of this guest house and I guess it was just after midnight. Our daughter came rushing out of her bedroom over to us. "What's wrong? Do you need to use the bathroom?" I asked. She shook her head. I remember that she looked a little shaken up. It was a rare look for a girl her age. She then said, "No, Mom, the lady outside said, can you let me in? But I can't reach the lock on the window. Can you do it for me?" I sat there staring at her, completely unable to understand what she had just said. We were literally in the middle of nowhere. We had drove miles and miles to get to this log cabin, and there wasn't another residence anywhere nearby. I didn't know how to approach the topic with my daughter. I didn't want to call her a liar for having a bad dream, so before my husband could open his mouth, I simply asked, "Who said that to you?" As soon as those words left my mouth, concern inside me like a flower bloomed. My question to my daughter boomed repeatedly in my head. "Who said that to you?" My daughter seemed to sense my distress, and I will be honest with you, I don't think I hid my concern very well. I must have looked racked with emotion. "The lady with the hurt head outside the window. She's been banging and banging on the glass, Mom." I shot a glance over to my husband and we jumped to our feet and marched straight into the room that my daughter was sleeping in. I went to turn on the lights, but my husband stopped me. He said that if there was someone outside, then we would be able to see them on the outside if the light was off, and they wouldn't be able to see us as easily. I saw something against the window. I know I saw something. There was this white shadow. It was kind of like a mist or some kind of smoke. It looked like the rough outline of a person, and then it was gone. It dissipated. My husband asked us to wait inside with the door locked while he went outside to check on the situation. My daughter then said the lady was sad. "Mom, she looked hurt too, and she looked like she had horns sometimes." I was frightened, really frightened at the idea that there might be someone out there trying to persuade my child to let them in, and equally frightened that I might have just had an encounter with the supernatural. My husband eventually returned from checking outside. I say eventually, it must have been a matter of a couple of minutes, but it felt like an eternity. I didn't see anyone out there, no footprints either. I mean, there's gravel around the whole building. Surely we would have heard someone run off. I didn't even hear a thing out there. I went by the door while he was stood there. I held my daughter's hand tightly as I approached. The door was open and my husband went to close it, but I stopped him. I wanted to take one good look out there. All that I could see was a dark sea of trees. The tree line was about 20 feet from the cabin, and all I could think of was, what could that tree line be hiding? The bugs chirped and the wind blew, and it was at that point that I shut the door. If someone needed help, like my daughter said that the woman at the window asked for, then surely you would come back while the door was wide open. Right, we all slept in the same bed that night, and thankfully nothing else suspicious happened after that. I will say that I was completely on edge until we left that cabin. It's the scariest thing that's ever happened to me. I always wonder who that hurt/horned lady was, and why she wanted my daughter to let her in. Maybe it was just a coincidence, but it all started with a program I watched on TV. I had been watching it for about 2 years or so, I guess, so you could call me a fan. It wasn't a popular TV show. It had a minor following online, and each episode was only about 30 minutes long. It has since gone off the air. But one of the segments of the show would ask the viewers to send in creepy submissions. To be honest, I think that was the best part of the show, and I didn't love the other segments. Just to give you a flavor of what some of the submissions were like, I'll give you some examples. There was one where this guy sent in a video of his pet acting really strangely. That one was pretty scary. Another one was of someone filming a very odd billboard as they passed through some town in the middle of nowhere. I can't remember what was on the billboard exactly, but that one was really weird. If you submitted a video of something strange and mysterious and your video was selected to be on the show, then you won a prize. Every time I watched that show, I would think to myself I could come up with something that would make it on the show. The price, whatever it was, didn't really matter to me. I just wanted to think up something cool to fit the theme. Then my idea came to me, although I guess it wasn't the most entertaining idea. It was my idea, and I couldn't wait to get started on my creation. I immediately started preparations, and the more I did, the more I loved. It was a fairly straightforward idea. I wanted to attach a noose to something like a tree limb and make a sign to go with it. That's all it was. I wanted my sign to read "Feel free to use this," and I wanted to be able to stake it into the ground, so all I needed was some wood after I made the sign. Next was the rope. I had to look online for how to make a noose. I thought it was going to be difficult, but it was a little easier than I thought. "Hi Jay, here, feel free to use this" is a common phrase that you might see outside of public restrooms and drinking fountains in parks. That should give you a little bit of an idea of the writer's intention. Back to the story. Now my creation was ready. All I needed to do next was to find a place to take a photo or a video of it, and then I could make my submission. I had some annual leave left available, so I decided to take a day off and drive out to the woods. I drove for miles to get there, because I knew that there was a quiet and peaceful forest just on the outskirts of the city. I got out of the car at a random spot and I carried my rope and my handmade sign with me, careful to make sure I wasn't seen by anyone. I knew these woods were very quiet, though I headed into the woods. I was walking through the forest, and as I got deeper in, I managed to find what I considered to be the perfect spot. I found a solid pine tree. It was pretty big and it had thick branches. There was a really thick one that jutted out about 3 m above ground level, which is close to 10 feet. Just in front of the tree, I stuck my "Please feel free to use this" sign into the ground. I made sure it was really deep. Thankfully, it had rained that day, so the ground was plenty moist. Next, I climbed the tree, which proved to be very difficult in those conditions, and then I shimmed over to the branch that I had selected and I tied the noose when all was complete. I climbed down from the tree and stood in admiration of my work. I was pretty satisfied by now. I'm sure you get my idea. I wanted to take a short video of me stumbling across a noose hanging from a tree, with a sign in front of it saying "Please feel free to use this." I know it's not in good taste, but I was certain it would have been good enough to get on that TV show. I thought it was actually a really cool idea. However, when I went to take the video, something didn't seem quite right to me. It looked all a little too new. If you know what I mean, the "Please feel free to use this" sign that I had bought from a hardware store in the city stood out like a sore thumb. Also, the wood I used to make my stake and sign looked like it had just been picked out of a timber yard. It looked fake, and though I wanted to make my video look real. One saving grace was the rope. That didn't look too bad. But this brand new sign supposedly being discovered deep in the forest would not do. I had to think of how I could make my video. I didn't want to go to all that effort and then not make a submission. I thought about it for a while, and then it came to me because it had been raining and more rain was forecast, and I figured that if I left my sign out there for a while it might end up looking a little more authentic. You know, a little more weather beaten or something like that. I figured the wood of the sign would get covered in dirt and leaves from the wind and rain, and that would create the desolate atmosphere that I was looking for. Of course, I was a little worried that some hiker or someone would find it and remove it, but I guess that was a risk and I just had to take. If I wasn't living in an apartment block, I would have put my sign in my garden or something. I was worried that someone might get mad and destroy the sign. You know, some overcautious, easy to offend note. All I didn't want the law to get involved either, because to me this was nothing but a light-hearted prank. I don't think that I had committed a crime. I mean, essentially it's just a piece of art, right? With all that in mind, I decided not to be that bothered by leaving it there. Who cares was my final thought, as I headed back to my car through the forest. The following couple of days became very busy for me, and before I knew it, I had completely forgotten about making my video and the sign and the news out there in the woods. Exactly 1 month later, I remembered that my piece of art was still out there in the woods. I remembered while I was watching that TV show, the one I was supposed to be submitting my video to. I immediately got in my car and drove off to the forest to see if it was still there during the month. I had forgotten about it. There had been some typhoons passing through my prefecture. When I arrived back at the forest, I noticed that there had been a lot of growth. The weeds and brush were difficult to wade through. The grass was thick and the forest floor was littered with broken tree branches and leaves. It made it tricky to find my creation, and I would be lying if I said I didn't get a little lost. It didn't help that it was getting dark out too. Not too dark though, I found it after a while, but the second I laid eyes on my creation, I knew that I couldn't capture on film as I had hoped for. The atmosphere surrounding the tree looked, in a word, desolate. My signboard, which when I left it was a brilliant white, had now gray and the letters had slightly run. One thing was the words "Feel free." They stood out as their letters looked completely untouched by the elements, and that was pretty eerie to me, but not as eerie as what I saw because someone had taken my prank very literally. The noose that hung from the tree now suspended a body a few feet off of the ground. I think it was a woman as the hair was long. It was matted with leaves and slick with rainwater. I couldn't see her face, and I'm very grateful for that. I didn't know what stage of decomposition the body was in, and I didn't want to. However, just based on how static the body hung, I could tell that there was no life there due to the wind. The body slowly swung side to side now and then in the tree limb, and the noose creaked and squeaked in the breeze. The body slowly twirled, and just at the point where it would have been side and facing me, revealing the face of the victim, I ran for it, and I ran as fast as I could. I was so scared. I'm still scared, by the way. I thought about calling the police, but it turned out I was too scared of doing that too. If I reported it to the police, then what would happen to me? They would find out that I was the one who set it up. They might even stupidly think that I encouraged people. Somehow I have wondered if what I did can be considered an assisted suicide. I don't think it should be. I don't think I should be accused of a crime when all I did was make a sign. I guess at the very worst it could be seen as a mean-spirited prank and nothing more than that. But the thought that I could be accused of goading her into making her final decision if I could be seen as encouraging her. That scares me the most, because that wasn't my intention and that could get me in a lot of trouble. This all happened 2 years ago and I still haven't reported it. I can't report it. I could get into so much trouble. Plays on my mind so often, though not because I feel some tremendous sense of guilt or anything, but because it could be the end of me. I keep an eye on the newspapers and the local news for any discoveries out there in those woods. But so far there's been nothing. That's pretty frightening for me too, because for all I know that body, that poor woman, may still be undiscovered, still squeaking and creaking in the breeze. I'm a real outdoorsy kind of guy. I love mountain hiking, climbing, fishing, going on long walks and camping out in the elements. I always go alone. I find it a much more immersive experience when it's just me and nature. Sometimes it can get pretty creepy though. I have had encounters with animals and I have heard weird noises out there in the dark of night. Nothing weirder than what I heard when I went mountain hiking last summer. After a long day of hiking, I set up my tent to get some sleep for the night. I had left it kind of late because I was pushing myself to cover as much ground as possible. It was twilight time by the time I got into my sleeping bag and almost dark out. I got to sleep pretty quickly, but later that night I was woken up by some strange noises. It sounded to me like water splashing, kind of like a stone being dropped into a deep puddle or something. I roughly knew where the nearest water source was. It was a river and it was pretty far from where I was camping. I lay there in my tent thinking what I'm pretty sure I'm not anywhere near it. I was half asleep in a dreamlike state. I was just on the edge of slipping back into sleep, but then I heard a different sound. This time it was more of a dry rustling sound. This one sounded like someone was wading through knee-high thick grass. This sound alerted me all of a sudden. I didn't feel that alone. I listened intently and after a couple of moments I figured out that dry rustling sound sounded as if it was circling my tent. I was really freaking out at that point. I mean, I had a knife, but it was in my rucksack at the foot of my sleeping bag. I was too scared to make a grab for it. I didn't want whoever was out there to know I was awake, because at least then I would have the element of surprise on my side if they thought I was asleep. I tensed up and tried to keep my heavy breathing to a minimum, all the while desperately trying to think of what to do next. Then, just as quickly as it began, it was over the rustling through the grass, headed back off the way it came. Then the first noise that I heard came back, that dripping watery sound, and then there was nothing, no more sounds, except for the distant cry of crickets and other nocturnal animals. I wasn't able to get back to sleep that night. I couldn't stop thinking of those sounds, the water, one in particular. My mind was torturing me with possibilities of what was out there. Could it be a bear? Some random person out here in the middle of nowhere? Was someone taking note of my position to potentially come back later? It could have been anything, and there was no way that I was going to get some sleep with those thoughts in my mind. Once it was light out, my confidence returned. I got up and took a look around. I wanted to find a logical explanation for what I had heard. I noticed something. It was a stone structure a little ways away from where I pitched my tent. It looked very old. It was a well. It was weird though, because what was the use of having a well this far out into the mountains? Perhaps there was a village here or a house in this area. In days gone by I thought about it to myself, until that thought was replaced by another unpleasant thought. Those noises that I had heard last night. It all made sense. Now to me it sounded like something climbed up out of the water of the well, circled my tent and then returned to the well. I went over to the well and gingerly looked inside. There was nothing but a reddish-brown color at the bottom of an empty well. That well had been dry for a very long time. I have no idea how what I heard the night before could have even been possible. It's the strangest thing that's ever happened to me. I couldn't help but wonder if I had heard some strange hark back to some years gone by. Perhaps something happened in that area here. I don't know what it was, but maybe those were residual sounds or something. This isn't my experience, but one I have heard from a very good friend of mine. I've asked him if I'm allowed to share it, and I just hope to do it justice. And oh my God, if this happened to me, I don't know how I would be able to sleep. I would go into the first-person narrative from this point forward. It all happened one night when I was out in the mountains. I was set to be staying with some friends that I hadn't seen since school. I was invited by a childhood friend, but besides him, everyone else was pretty much a stranger. We were set to be staying in a mountain lodge. It looked really nice, just a pure wooden structure. A log cabin essentially. They had all raved about the lodge before, and I was excited to see if it lived up to the hype it did. It was a really nice place. It was in the middle of the mountains, pretty rustic. We had plans to go on a hike the following morning. We were supposed to be getting an early night, but we ended up staying up later than expected. I turned all the lights off in the lodge in preparation to turn in for the night, and then I heard something strange. I heard this weird dull noise at the lodge's door. It wasn't very loud. It was barely noticeable. We had left the door open a little to allow airflow, so it was a bit weird to me. It sounded like something sharp hitting a tree, like those axe-throwing thingies, but lighter. My friend, who was the sort of leader of our little hiking get-together as he was the oldest, approached the door and pushed it shut and locked it. He didn't say a word, and neither did anyone else in the cabin. No one seemed to be that bothered by the noise, so neither was I. After that, everyone went to their beds and we all went to sleep. When the morning came around, I got up to wash my face. It looked like a warm morning, so I opened the door to allow in some fresh air. I was a bit curious about that noise I had heard the night before too. What I saw that morning was pretty freaky. There were loads of these weird fishing hook-like hooks and nails jutting out of the door. They had been stabbed into the wood. From each hook was this thick coarse black thread that trailed off into the distant trees and bush. I couldn't even see where it ended. I stood there completely perplexed by what I was seeing, and after a couple of moments, some of the others in the lodge came downstairs and stood by me by the cabin's open door. Something came down from the mountains last night. Maybe there wasn't much prey in the mountains last night. The guys were saying stuff like that when they saw the hooks in the door, and that made me feel really weird. I felt like I was the only one who didn't really know what was going on. They didn't seem that fazed. After those brief comments, the conversation changed. I couldn't stand it. I had to ask them about those hooks. Locals say that a disturbing woman lives out there in the woods. She uses them hooks you saw to hunt down small animals apparently here. Look at this. One of them said, as they pointed at one of those gnarled hooks splintered in the wooden door. He didn't point at the hook. He pointed at the thread. Well, I thought it was thread at first, but on closer inspection I realized that it was human hair, matted, gross human hair that had been woven into this kind of rope-like equality. It was disgusting. Before we left, one of the guys pulled out his machete and prized those hooks out of the door, and then cut the thick rope of hair into pieces. We took those fishing hooks with us back down the mountain. I say fishing hooks, but they weren't exactly made of iron. They were more like splintered bone and sharpened rock. We threw them in the garbage at the foot of the mountain. It really freaked me out once again. It felt like I was the only one who had found it strange. Nothing happened after that. It just seemed as if people were fine with this feral person living out there in the mountains. I decided not to bother hiking the following day. It was all weird, far too weird for me. Has anyone heard of any strange rumors or stories out of Mount Mizugaki in Yamanashi? I had a weird experience there. I climbed it a few years back on August the 4th. I started my climb during the evening. Halfway through the climb I was confronted by something very strange. By the way, I'm a very experienced mountain climber. I've been climbing mountains like Mizugaki for about 8 years. I've had some pretty interesting climbs in those years, but nothing like my Mount Mizaki climb. According to my log data, I started my climb at 4:43, and I began it with the Kuro Mori course, which I believe is to the north. About an hour and a half after I had started my climb, I reached the waterfall that they have there, and from there I could see the fog or mist. I didn't expect these conditions, but I was confident that I knew my way. The signage was excellent and all my equipment was in perfect working order, and I was well provisioned. Of course I had the means to make a bivouac if the weather turned for the worst, so I decided to proceed with my climb. This turned out to be a very bad piece of judgment by me. After I had passed the waterfall, I proceeded for another 40 minutes. I remember that the next time I looked at my watch after that I just kept going. I remember that the next time I looked at my watch it was 701. I stopped because it was getting darker and the fog seemed to be getting thicker, so I equipped my headlamp and turned on my flashlight. When I turned on that flashlight, I was a little shocked to see that there was someone walking up ahead of me in the fog. I could only just make out their silhouettes. I didn't want to hike with some stranger, so I just decided to hang back and drop my pace a little. I don't mean to be antisocial. I just like hiking alone, to each their own right. The fog got thicker and thicker. It was getting ridiculous for an August climb. I was pretty much relying on the light of the person up ahead to see which directions I should take. Twists in the road. Felt strange that night. Something was definitely unusual, but I'm a stubborn guy. I probably should have turned back, but I kept going. I didn't want to lose to the mountain even if I slowed my pace right down. The distance between me and that other climber never seemed to change. It was constant, and that went for the light I was seeing up ahead of me. I noticed something about that light at that point too. The light's color seemed off. Usually hikers and mountain climbers carry these strong LED lights, which can really cut through the darkness. The person up ahead from me had this weird orangey-yellow light. That seemed a little out of date and a little odd for the conditions. Whoever was in front of me looked back now and then as well, and I would have expected the light of an LED torch to blind me, but that light didn't. I checked my watch again and it was just after 9:00 p.m. I didn't feel as if there was any sign of the summit up ahead. Since that person in front of me looked back so often, I could make that judgment. Things were getting a little tricky. I was finding it harder and harder to see my way. I took the time to stop and check my GPS positioning against the map I had brought with me. Well, I really couldn't get a good signal on my GPS system, but I didn't panic because I knew that fog could sometimes interfere with that. I got out my altimeter. This is a tool that can be used to predict the altitude one can be at during a climb. It also helps with directions of slopes, etc. The altitude was 1870 m, and the slope direction was due west. In other words, I had ended up veering off the beaten path considerably. I was supposed to be directly east of the mountain's peak. I hope that makes sense. I guess it would be hard to envision if you haven't seen that mountain range. Well, I guess it served me right for following the other hiker up ahead, right? I should have just turned back. I was annoyed at myself, but the worst thing I could do at that point would have been to try and find my way back to the beaten path, especially when you consider this dense fog. I planned on staying right where I was until the morning came, in the hope that the fog might have cleared a little by then. I began preparations to bivouac for the night. While I was preparing my little camping area, I saw that light from the other hiker flickering just off in the distance. Weird dude, I thought to myself as my hands got to work. I guess that the light could have been some kind of reflection from someplace else in the fog. I didn't really view that though. I pitched up my little tent and then I ate some food, and after that I got some sleep. I woke up a little later when I thought it was getting brighter out. But when I fully opened my eyes, there was nothing but darkness all around me. I realized at that point that the light that woke me had not been the morning light. It must have been the light from that other hiker H. What the hell was this guy doing, I wondered, and why was he so close to my camp? I guess that he didn't want to be on his own, but if I'm perfectly honest, his presence that close to me felt a little scary. I say he, but it could have just as easily been a woman. This guy was a complete stranger, and for some reason he or she wanted to stay close to me. And that's pretty weird if you ask me. The more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable I felt. I wanted to get away from them, so I picked up my stuff, and I knew for a fact that if I headed down the mountain in a southwesterly direction, I would reach a rest hut. It was just a small wooden lodge that hikers would add to escape the elements. Sure, I would be undoing some of the great work I had done by climbing that far, but I felt as if it was worth it to get away from that other hiker. I had my compass and my altimeter, so it was all fine. I think the best way to describe myself back in those days was physically strong and fit, but not mentally strong or fit. I think I had a lot to learn, and some parts of my personality, such as the stubborn side and the impulsive actions that I took, proved that I probably wasn't in the right headspace for such a crazy solo climb. It might sound like I'm being a little too harsh on myself there, But I know that careless actions cost lives. I looked at my watch again and it was now past 1:00 a.m. in the morning, way too late to be trying to find my way in the darkness. When I looked at my watch, I heard a woman's voice. It was clear and very close to me. The voice said, "Where are you going? That's not the right way." I spun around and I looked frantically all over for the owner of that voice. My spine turned to ice as my headlamp revealed no one, just rows and rows of empty trees and thick rolling fog. The light I had seen earlier was no longer visible, making it even harder to see. I started to run in panic. I was freaking out. I didn't know where that voice came from and it really scared me. It was like I was having auditory hallucinations. I ended up out of breath as expected. Then I saw it. The light from earlier was back, and it was shining through the trees from a southwest direction. In other words, the direction I was heading in it couldn't be possible. I had been rushing down a pathless part of the mountain, and there was no way that light should have appeared in front of me when it was behind me. I was scared, but there wasn't much I could do. I wanted to get to the safety of that emergency hut. I hurried down the mountain towards that familiar light. I was so nervous that something was going to happen. When I got close, I couldn't help but feel a little in danger. I think the thick fog and the darkness had forced me to lose my composure. The voice I had heard earlier seemed to be coming from all directions. As I ran, it was saying things like, "Not that way. It's dangerous if you go that way." It was like I was surrounded by something, or it was echoing in my head. The light was disappearing and then reappearing again in different locations. Then there was more and more lights. This all went on till about 4:00 a.m. I was feeling dizzy, probably due to the fear, and then I stood on something. I looked down and I saw that I had stepped on a bouquet of flowers, and as soon as I stepped on them, all the lights and the voices abruptly stopped. There was a strong smell of burning incense for a brief second, and then it was all gone. I noticed that it was starting to get brighter suddenly, and the fog was beginning to clear too. I quickly pulled out my GPS system and made a plan on how to get to the emergency shelter hut. I raced to the hut. I think that I surprised the old man who was sitting there because he asked me almost instantly if I was okay. I don't know if it was the adrenaline or something, but I decided to tell him everything. He told me a couple of things about Mount Mizugaki that I found pretty creepy and pretty interesting. The old man said that Mizugaki mist is connected to another world, and it is the belief of the locals that this mist is responsible for several missing person cases. I asked if someone had gone missing recently, and if that was why there was a bouquet of flowers near the emergency shelter. He said that he didn't think that there had been any recent missing person cases or any reported deaths. I asked if people still brought flowers to the mountains in their memory, and he said that no one had gone missing in a long time, so he didn't think so. I don't know if any of this was true or false, though it was at that point that I realized it wasn't just the one voice I had heard out there in the fog. There was an abundance of voices, and they were all females too. He said all the missing person cases were exclusively female, and at times during that wild period where I was running around like a maniac, I could hear shrieking and screaming. Something has definitely happened out in those mountains if you ask me, but I have no idea why it was revealed to me. I always wonder why this happened to me. It was the most frightening experience I've had in my life.